Let me begin by thanking the NAS for arranging this conference and this panel. And since we're talking about bubbles, I thought I'd begin by sketching out kind of the case that there are two possible bubbles within higher education, and you can almost think of it as there being a race between these two possible bubbles to see which one is going to burst first. So what do we mean when we're talking about a bubble? The defining characteristic of a bubble is unsustainable growth. And when you look around at higher education, there's really two areas where there may be unsustainable growth. The first is enrollment, and the second is cost. So let's take these one at a time. There's a couple reasons to think we might that the current trends in enrollment might be unsustainable. The first is the mismatch between enrollment and academic preparation. So if the ACT has this college readiness benchmarks, and it basically tests for whether students are ready for college or not. And they find that 1 in 4 high school graduates is academically prepared for college in all 4 areas that they test, which are English, mathematics, reading, and science. So 1 in 4, 25% are ready for college, yet 68% of high school graduates enroll in college. That's kind of problematic, and that explains or helps to explain a lot of the depressing statistics we see in other areas of higher education. For instance, 1/3 of college students have to enroll in remedial courses. Well, they have to enroll in these courses because they weren't prepared for college in the first place. In addition, we have a 58% graduation rate. And that's for 4-year colleges. The graduation rate for 2-year colleges is 30%. So this is not too surprising when you realize that the students are coming in ill-prepared for college. So that's the first reason that we might have a problem with enrollment. The second reason we might have a problem with enrollment is the mismatch between enrollment and the labor market. So according to surveys of students, only about 60% of college graduates have a job that requires a college degree. And this number actually varies if the government is conducting the analysis. The Bureau of Labor Statistics classifies jobs by their required education, and according to them, there's 48% of all college graduates are in jobs that do not require a college degree. So somewhere between 48% and 60% of college graduates have jobs somewhere between 40% and 48% of college graduates have jobs that do not require a college degree. And there's even some fields where it's pretty uncontroversial to say that there's an oversupply of graduates relative to the jobs available. Law schools are the prime example of here, and there's also some humanities programs like English PhD programs. They've been overproducing relative to the number of jobs available for quite some time. So each of these is kind of interesting in and of themselves, but when you combine them, they get really eye-opening. So what this means when you combine these two things is that for every 100 students who begin at a 4-year college, only 58 manage to graduate within 6 years. 4 years later, only 35 have managed to find jobs that require a degree. So in other words, only about 1/3 of college entrants are able to complete and make use of their college education within 10 years of first enrolling. This immediately raises the question of whether the resources that are being spent on the other 2/3 could possibly be spent more wisely someplace else. Okay, so that's enough on the enrollment bubble for now. Let me change gears a little bit and talk about the cost bubble. And I'm using costs both in terms of what colleges spend per student and in terms of what students are paying. While the recent recession and growth in federal financial aid has resulted in a slight reduction in the past couple years, it's pretty clear that the trend over the past few decades has been for the cost of college to go up. But at the same time, college has been cutting costs in core areas like instruction. And as a result of these two trends, we're now at the point where many colleges are being paid more to provide the education than they are actually spending providing it. Bob Samuels, who's a professor out in California, has estimated that public universities currently spend about $1,500 per student on professor salaries. And yet they charge an average of $7,000 and get another $8,000 in funding from the state. which means that they're paid about 10 times as much as their direct instructional costs. Now, there's a whole bunch of other valid educational expenditures, things like libraries, classrooms, registrar's offices, that kind of stuff. And when you take those into account, it's not quite as skewed, but the basic conclusion stands. There's still a lot of colleges out there that are being paid more to provide an education than they're actually spending providing it. So just as a concrete example, consider the success that many colleges have had in lowering instructional costs through increasing class sizes and replacing tenure-track faculty with adjuncts. Now, both of those things might have big quality implications, but one thing they certainly do is they lower costs. And they lower costs so much that the average cost in a large lecture class now is $60 per student. Unfortunately, this lower cost has not been transferred through to students in the form of lower tuition. And indeed, colleges are charging each of those students in that class hundreds or even thousands of dollars to sit in that class, that it's only costing them $60 per student to produce. And so this gap between what colleges are spending and what they're being paid is unsustainable. It's not going to last forever. So we're basically left with a potential enrollment bubble and a potential cost bubble. And what I find really interesting is the interaction between the two. So if the cost bubble continues unabated, then that makes the enrollment bubble more severe and vice versa. In fact, the enrollment bubble is only really problematic because we spend so much money sending students to college. If it only cost $100 a class, it wouldn't matter if everybody went to college and 90% of people didn't graduate, because it would still be cheaper than what we're doing right now. Conversely, if it costs $50 or $100 or $200,000 per student in a college classroom, it just doesn't make much sense to send too many people to college on cost-benefit grounds. Similarly, if the enrollment bubble continues unabated, the cost becomes more severe, as coming up with the required funding becomes more difficult given the strained budgets of families and governments. Now, so the bubbles can make each other worse, but what's also very interesting is that if one of the bubbles bursts, it kind of debubbles the other bubble. So if the cost bubble bursts and costs really do fall significantly, all of a sudden it makes sense to send pretty much everybody to college because there's very little cost to do so. And that of course undermines the case for the enrollment bubble. Similarly, if the enrollment bubble bursts and people start doing alternatives to college, be they online education or whatever, that basically transforms the traditional college experience into a conspicuous consumption good. And the whole point of these goods is to spend a lot of money, which kind of undermines the case for the cost bubble. So we basically have a situation where only one of these bubbles will burst, and we're basically in a race to see which one it is. So which one is winning the race? The argument that the enrollment bubble will pop first is based on basically an extrapolation of trends that we're already sort of beginning to see. There's a growing awareness of the continued deterioration in the financial return to college. So students and parents and families, they're starting to realize that college isn't the safe investment it once was. Wages for recent college graduates have been falling. A lot of them are struggling to find jobs, and yet tuition keeps increasing. And what this means is that the expected return to college is falling. And it's still positive in most cases, but it's falling, and in some cases it's actually negative. In fact, one Nobel Prize-winning scholar has estimated that college is a bad financial investment for as many as 1/3 of students. Now, this realization that college is no longer a guaranteed safe investment is beginning to affect enrollment decisions. And we're beginning to see this in kind of two areas. The first is where students are going to college. So there's the beginnings of a possible trend, of students shying away from kind of expensive, mid-tier private schools towards lower-cost state schools. So we're starting to see students react and make different decisions about where they enroll. We're also beginning to see students make different decisions about whether to enroll at all. And this is most evident in law schools. So law schools have been in the news lately for having a very terrible job market. A lot of their graduates are really struggling to find gainful employment. And as a result, we're starting to see sharp cutbacks in applications and enrollments. And if law schools are kind of the canaries in the coal mine for the rest of higher education, that indicates that the enrollment bubble might be the first one to pop. What about the cost bubble? So judging from the newspapers, the main threat to the traditional college on the cost front is essentially this online education, and particularly these massive online classes, these MOOCs. And these MOOCs definitely have the potential for huge reductions in costs, but I don't think they can pop the cost bubble alone. And the reason has to do with the underlying source of higher education bubbles. So the two main drivers of the enrollment bubble are pretty straightforward. There's government funding, and there's a lack of reliable information on outcomes and educational quality. So to the extent that too many people are going to college, or too many people are going to certain colleges, or too many people are going to majoring in certain majors, it's largely because the government is covering many of the costs, essentially shielding students from the financial consequences of their decision. But also to a large extent that students are ill-informed, and in some cases they're actually being misinformed about the likely outcomes of going to college. The cost bubble is a bit more complicated, and the key insight here is to understand that colleges operate under Howard R. Bowen's revenue theory of costs. And he wrote a great book on this. I'll give you the Cliffs Notes version, which is basically colleges raise all the money they can, and they spend all the money they raise. And the reason colleges do this boils down to lack of information on outcomes and quality. Indeed, collectively, we can't even agree on what the outcomes of colleges are or should be, and what constitutes a high-quality college, let alone on how to measure these things. And without any way to demonstrate that they provide a high-quality education and that their graduates fare well once released into the wild, colleges can't compete based on value, which is essentially quality divided by price. And instead, they have to compete based on perceived quality, which is just a fancy way of saying reputation. And one of the only ways you can boost your reputation is to spend a lot more money on flashy things. What this means is that how much a college spends is determined entirely by how much money it can raise, and will be completely unrelated to both how much it spends on actually educating students, and also how much students or policymakers think that education is worth. In other words, lowering the cost of colleges of providing an education, which is what these online courses can and will eventually do, will not automatically result in lower costs to students. The key missing component to make that happen is information on outcomes and educational quality that allows for comparisons across institutions and across programs. What this means is that the cost bubble can be burst simply by providing more information to students. This will replace the competition that's currently based on reputation, which tends to drive costs up, with competition based on value, which tends to drive costs down. There's two basic pieces of information that I think would basically accomplish this. And the first is actually determining how much students are learning. So there's a lot of different tests out there. The CLA has been getting a lot of attention due to academically adrift. But there's also all sorts of other tests out there. And these tests can be used to actually gauge how much students are learning. So there's a lot of fields with an outside certification exam. And you can use those to create a value-added the value added of an individual school for their students. So things like the CPA exam for accountants, the bar exam for lawyers, there's architectural exams, there's actuarial exams. These exams could basically be used to create a measure of how much students are learning at particular colleges and at particular programs. A second key piece of information, particularly for the more vocational fields, would be labor market outcomes. It's really a scandal, and I don't use that word lightly, that we do not provide students with information on the employment rates and the earnings distributions for every degree program that enrolls students that are using federal financial aid money. This data already exists, and yet we keep it from students, basically forcing them to make one of the most important decisions in their life artificially blindfolded about this very, very important aspect of their education. Okay, so if we had these two pieces of information, so information on how much students are learning, information on kind of labor market outcomes, that would that would allow students to make more informed choices about whether to enroll in college and where to attend when they do enroll. But until we have this information, there's no real way for alternative methods of education to demonstrate and prove that they're providing just as good of an education for a fraction of the price. So I think that MOOCs and adaptive course material and all these kind of new educational tools, I think that they can revolutionize education. I don't think that that's going to happen until we fix the information problem. So overall, I'm pretty pessimistic about the business model of traditional colleges, but I'm pretty optimistic when it comes to the future of education. And it's really my hope that this more and better information on college quality will burst the cost bubble, bringing down costs, and that will ultimately make education affordable to anybody who wants it. Thank you.